Generative AI, in my opinion, is one of the biggest plights of modern day society. It is disgusting, putrid, ugly, anti-art, and anyone who touches it and calls themselves an AI artist is a hack without a creative bone in their body, or runs a local restaurant and doesn't know any better, or is your grandma stumbling across a Facebook video of a woman turning into a snake on America's Got Talent. I'm so sorry to my aunt who showed this to me on Thanksgiving and asked me if this was real. And now, the United States government is using generative AI to minimize the harm of their crimes, ignore the need for due process, and demonize immigrants, undocumented individuals, and likely others in the future. And recently there was a massive influx of these Studio Ghibli-like images seemingly created overnight because of OpenAI and therefore ChatGPT creating a brand new image generator inside of their program, which works effectively like any of these other existing programs that you see online, where you type in a prompt, you receive an image in a desired style if you ask for it in that style, including this Studio Ghibli type art that we're seeing online, which in reality is done in a style much closer to Hayao Miyazaki films and other films from the company, and also has this weird yellowish tint that now is a great way to determine whether or not an image is AI or not, at least in terms of ChatGPT. And to me, this also feels antithetical to Hayao Miyazaki, the entirety of Studio Ghibli, and also, I feel like this is the byproduct of people, largely Westerners, and it's fair to say mostly Americans, ignoring the themes present in Studio Ghibli films, especially the environmental themes and anti-imperialist themes, and focusing on just the aesthetic of these movies. Today, I want to talk about the fundamental misunderstanding of these films, the creation of these generative AI images, and how that all feels connected to me, at least by Americans who've engaged with these films. But first, I need to talk a lot about generative AI and why I dislike it so much. Because if I can be frank, I was shocked by the sheer number of these images appearing overnight in the past couple of weeks, and really because of also how technically accessible they were before on other platforms, but maybe this also just speaks to the wide reach of ChatGPT specifically. Supposedly, ChatGPT had somewhere around 100 million active users in November 2022, before rapidly growing to 400 million active users during April 2025. And again, this isn't even including the users on other generative AI platforms, and I really hate all these platforms equally. Whether they exist to generate images or text, it's destructive in nearly every single way, either through looking at the ways that people use these platforms to minimize the creative process, to take away the beauty of human connection, either through using these chatbots as full-blown therapists or friends, or for their adult needs, even though they're designed to validate every single idea that you have and provide an answer that makes you feel good and not challenge you, or replace your everyday search engine, which are now plagued also by AI and feel completely unusable because of it. Seriously, just think about the ways that Google has changed over the past 5 years and how you can't find anything anymore. And going beyond that, I generally have no idea how anyone can feel secure using ChatGPT as a search engine and trust its responses. I don't believe anybody who uses these platforms are bad people. I have friends that use them, and they know I judge them for it and hate it, but we have to recognize the impacts of these programs, and that doesn't even touch on the anti-art element that I focus on in this video. For those who are uninformed and haven't gotten too mad or in the middle of a diatribe in the comment section about how great generative AI is, there is growing documentation of how many of these images are generated from stolen material. In December 2023, a Charlotte subsidiary of NBC shared that Eliana Esquivel, a young artist, learned that her own work was being stolen by one of these ChatGPT-like programs. She noticed a noticeable dip in sales and commissions, and when looking at the website haveibeentrained.com, her art had been scraped for a dataset for a generative AI platform. And this leads to a question that a lot of artists have been grappling with ever since these generative AI platforms have gotten larger. What happens if I remove my art from this dataset? How do I ensure this doesn't happen again with another dataset? She named having her art stolen and posted on other people's t-shirts before. What if someone also does that with a generative AI image that is stolen in the likeness of her art, or just is a stolen version of her art? And while she named also enjoying these shifts in her artistic process, it's also led her to transition to making 3D art, a whole other medium, because of all this. In an article from the Smithsonian in January 2024, they shared learning of a leaked list of artists whose work was plagiarized by Midjourney because of David Holtz, the company's founder, sharing this over Discord just wildly, and then he deleted it, but people had already saved the list. Some of the artists on this list that had their art stolen included Tim Burton, Pablo Picasso, Norman Rockwell, Walt Disney, Banksy, and I can guarantee Hayao Miyazaki and others at Studio Ghibli had their work stolen too. And every so often on social media we get that clip of Miyazaki floating around on the internet from 2016 where he talks about his dislike of machines being able to learn how to write. A number of contrarians online like to point out that the context of this clip is different than talking about modern day generative AI, and sure, That is true, but this conversation is initiated by Hayao Miyazaki watching a computer-generated clip of a zombie and being upset due to having a friend with a disability. It is ultimately about generative AI appearing in the future and Miyazaki being fearful about what's next in the world, and that he was afraid people are going to use this because they're not confident in their abilities as an artist, and he is right. People are capable of learning how to draw or engage with art. Anyone who uses generative AI is not reaching towards some form of accessible art for all. They are ultimately lazy individuals who are using art stolen from other artists in order to make a tacky image that requires no skill at all, which is why the term generative AI artist is an oxymoron. So, if it is a practice that Hayao Miyazaki and likely others from Studio Ghibli hate, why would you do it? Why do you not have any respect for the artist? How can you see so many films with so many environmentalist messages and ignore that and engage in a practice that is so destructive to the environment? For those who are unaware, it is estimated that the use of a search engine that has integrated AI into its web search is likely to use anywhere from 50 to 100 times the amount of water compared to your typical web search. Now, many will counter me and say, well, James, this isn't true. I asked ChatGPT this information and it said it used the least amount of water. That is a real interaction I had online. And to that, I say that ChatGPT again likes to provide an answer that you're looking for. ChatGPT is unable to discern what is a good resource and what is a bad resource, and sometimes there's been accounts of these generative AI engines making up their own sources. A strong example of this is asking ChatGPT information about any film that's readily available online, such as the release date of a film, who starred in it, some basic behind-the-scenes knowledge, or a summary, and it can be wrong. While I'm not willing to plunge the planet deeper into climate crisis to prove a point, there's a reason why I used already existing generative AI images for earlier in my video. In times in the past when I was ignorant of this knowledge and I've used ChatGPT, I've in particular noticed that it's willing to pull data sets from fanfilms.fandom.com, a website where users can create their own fanfiction around popular characters such as Batman, and sometimes imagining sequels to movies that we're already anticipating, because I remember a number of people doing this for Jurassic World Dominion before we even understood that that movie would forget what dinosaurs were in a focus towards Locust being the villain. Tangent aside, let's zone back in on the environmental impact of these programs, because to some extent there is no real clarity, just an approximation of how AI affects the resources on this planet. We know that these programs use millions of gallons of water. We know that companies like Google are using more than 50% of their estimate emissions in the last 5 years due to the implementation of AI in their search engine. We also know that in areas where they're building these giant data centers to gain the necessary computing power, so you can look at a picture of a giant dog fighting Godzilla while Goku spectates in a cyberpunk setting, there have been unpredictable power outages and the cause is clear. Near our brand new data center that Mark Zuckerberg built for Meta in Mansfield, Georgia, there is a family that lives 400 yards from this building, and there is sediment all in their pipes. Their pipes barely run. Their faucets cannot run. They cannot flush their toilets. They have to buy gallons of water from the store so that they could poop. There is so much power going to this facility that there's less power to go around, and the cost of power has rapidly risen in this area. And for families that have lived in these areas for generations, they didn't choose to live near these facilities, and the cost of how this affects the environment and local communities comes straight towards the little people. These financial pressures never come back around to the billion-dollar companies creating them. So while we don't have exact and definitive data about how generative AI is affecting our planet and our resources, we have a strong approximation, and there is strong evidence saying that this strain is much worse than we comprehend. In Europe, at least in the near future, there's a couple of laws in place that will make sure that these companies have to provide this data at least to the EU, but who knows if an American politician can comprehend the need to have this conversation, especially considering how many politicians get money from big tech. And regardless of legislation or exact data, the cost is clear, and while individually this cost may feel low for every single person using these platforms, the collective cost is literally setting the planet on fire and feels so antithetical to Studio Ghibli as a company. But hey, ignorance is just one thing, but I do also think that there's at least a part of this conversation that's connected to the lack of interest that Americans or maybe Westerners have in engaging in the themes of Studio Ghibli films, or just how quickly they miss them. Reducing these themes into a few ideas when there's 24 films made by 7 different directors underneath the company that often feels unique from director to director feels, very, very, very daunting in a way. But at least when I look at Miyazaki's films, Miyazaki often talks about anti-imperialism, which I gotta say is wild, considering how many think pieces I've seen online that have come across from conservatives who thought that Miyazaki was one of them, or how many people I know personally who've gotten in my face and said that, you know what, Miyazaki is an imperialist. He made The Wind Rises phrases with their full chest out and completely miss that's a movie about a guy who liked planes who realized that they'd later be used for something awful later on. It's like people who saw Oppenheimer and thought the movie was pro-bomb. I also don't want to minimize the impact that the dubs had on people. Watching anime dubbed often makes it accessible to young children and for Americans or English speakers, while it can introduce them to Kirsten Dunst, Liam Neeson, Michael Keaton, or Christian Bale at a young age. There's sometimes changes made to dialogue that are often designed to soften the blow of the difficulty of these endings or narrative points in these films, and sometimes reduce the meaning of these films, taking away meaningful commentary in order to appeal to a younger audience. And this isn't a debate about what's better in terms of sub versus dubs. There have been mangaka who've come out and said that specifically a dub or a sub seems stronger. I know there's a pretty decent consensus online that says that the Yu Yu Hakusho dub is much stronger than the original Japanese release because of the strong voice acting and the translation work and its tone. And while entirely memorable for anybody who grew up on Toonami, including myself, the Funimation dub of Dragon Ball for sure has that epic Falconer score and has some of the most memorable moments of voice acting of my entire childhood. It is fairly well known that Sean Schemmel's Goku presents the character in an entirely different way than the original Japanese version of the show. Masaka Nozawa's take on the character has him speak with the equivalent of a Japanese country accent, and has become my definitive take of the character when I watched Dragon Ball Super as it aired in Japanese. This has all led me to take on a philosophy of wanting to have the greatest understanding of a director or artist's intentions when watching an anime, leading me to prefer the sub to the dub for nearly everything I watch, and there is no answer to this, but I do think it contributes to a misunderstanding of the original text, which in the case of Studio Ghibli or in the case of The Castle in the Sky, which the main changes in the dialogue add a lot of comedy that's not present in the original film, and also take away some of the world building with the script and choosing to have some of the dialogue focus on the characters as well, often because these changes were dictated by Disney, who thought that, you know what, American audiences aren't that smart. And kind of speaking to that, there's also a pretty notable change when it comes to the score, not allowing for nearly as much silence as the original film, with the original score being about 39 minutes long in a 2-hour and 4-minute film, where there might be some gaps of music missing for 7 or 8 minutes, something very common in, world cinema across the world, even children's films. But because Disney executives at the time thought that American audiences could not handle musicless animation for more than 3 minutes at a time, instead of expanding the already existing score, they threw it out and made a new score that ballooned to about 90 minutes long. And of course, these dubs are largely high quality, they're well regarded for reason, but for some, including myself, learning that a few simple changes to a line at the finale of Spirited Away or Kiki's Delivery Service, changing the meanings of these endings, make it really easy for me to just watch the subtitled versions of these films moving forward, especially knowing the depth of these movies. Although not technically the first Studio Ghibli film, or even the first film made by this group of collaborators, Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind has since been added to a number of physical media release lines for the company as an official Studio Ghibli release. Therefore, I'm treating it as a Studio Ghibli film in this video. Please get over it. And regardless of the semantics of whether or not this is the first Studio Ghibli film, I'm sure a number of people will argue this in the comment section. Clearly, this plot involving an apocalyptic war and warring nations and empires and a toxic forest filled with giant mutant bugs touches on the anti-imperialist and environmentalist themes of Miyazaki, addressing this pointless need for humanity to engage in war that will one day destroy society and civilization as we know it. An example of this is in 2021, it was named that the United States military were a nation state, it'd be the entity that emits the 47th amount of CO2. Now, all the militaries across the world contribute to greenhouse gases, that is known, but looking back at the past 2 years, obviously, recognizing that Israel has done harm to Palestine long before October 7, 2023, Israel bombing Palestine and neighboring countries has created millions of tons of waste, it has poisoned water, it has been hypothesized that the world has been superheated because of a large number of these bombs. These films, while also rooted in a fantastical world, are also rooted in just real life social commentary. I'll name this already for people that complain too. I won't be covering every Studio Ghibli film in this video or even some of these films extensively. I'm sorry for fans of Ocean Waves or Tales from Earthsea or Earwig and the Witch, but even jumping towards Castle in the Sky, this film is clearly about our connection to technology and nature, and while we shouldn't view our favorite artists or idols in isolation or with coherent politics, that's just a flawed way of engaging with art or just artists. This film was also inspired by Hayao Miyazaki traveling to Wales and witnessing the 1984 to 1985 coal strikes that took place. He believed that these men were fighting to protect a way of life, and I think most people can agree with that, but he also believed that their loss was monumental to the community, and it feels really bizarre to think of a man that most people think of as an environmentalist, knowing his feelings about these men. They exist in contradiction to a lot of the themes that people perceive in his films, and I think it's okay to sit with that contradiction. And clearly these environmentalist themes continue in his other movies, such as My Neighbor Totoro, which while I viewed in such a playful way after watching the film as many people do, witnessing these creatures in the woods and seeing this cat bus. But once I had someone point out to me that this film's post-World War II setting makes you sit in the need for care for Japanese land after the destruction brought on by the dropping of the atomic bomb, the film takes on a much more political context. While I'm by no means an expert, I guarantee that there are others that are far more proficient than me on and off this website that can describe this to you, but it's important to name the practice of Shintoism being pretty core to at least Miyazaki's films. Historically, Shintoism was viewed closer to a religion, predating Buddhism's appearance in Japan, and becoming centered around a belief in the importance of nature and the idea of spirits residing in anything, not just humans, but plants, animals, and also objects. For many people now, while they don't practice it as a religion, it can be, described closer to being a value system. And clearly the spiritual element feels present in a number of Miyazaki's films, including not only My Neighbor Totoro, but also is present in Princess Mononoke, Spirited Away, and The Boy and the Heron. Jumping further ahead, I know Western audiences are capable of recognizing that there is a deep and impactful subject matter in Studio Ghibli films. Many name Grave of the Fireflies as one of the most devastating films that they've ever seen, which only makes me say two things. One, despite crying frequently watching films, I've never cried watching Grave of the Fireflies, which just speaks to maybe how many sad films I've seen. And two, anyone can clearly understand the subject matter of a film and understand its gravity, yet I've had people argue with me on the internet saying the film isn't appropriate for children, but it is a kids movie. What about it is inappropriate? This is a real circumstance that happened to many people in Japan specifically. The unfortunate circumstances that follow our two leads are representative of real tragedy. My mother and her family experienced being refugees when being children. There isn't a real protection from what is reality for some, and I think that being honest and having genuine conversations with kids while they're younger is a lot more helpful than trying to protect them entirely. Now, I'm not saying show this to your 4-year-old, but I think a 10-year-old could handle this. If I pirated The Godfather at that age and was okay, I think your kids will be too watching Grave of the Fireflies. Bringing this back to generative AI for a second, I actually want to shout out and directly cite a written piece by Daniela Mazzio titled Kiki's Delivery Service is a Rebuke to the Miyazaki AI Trend, which presented an idea that I hadn't thought about before reading, and just want to highlight this article, which I've attached down below. Now, if she ever sees this video, one, I deeply apologize if I mispronounce her name, and two, I also think about her whenever I think about the Lydia Tarr parody page that she created on Twitter a couple of years ago, the very same one that ended when Lydia Tarr died falling down these stairs of the Dolby Theater outside the 2023 Oscars. But more importantly, Daniela is a fantastic writer. I really don't want to lose sight of that. And similarly to my experience with Studio Ghibli, Daniela names that her first film from the studio was Kiki's Delivery Service, which was also the first film I saw from them. It's a film about a young witch finding her place in the world, and I think a film that as I've returned to it as an adult, one that has moved me quite a bit, helping me think about the freedom that Kiki is granted, and really the space that she's allowed to become who she wants to be, and that is what's needed to be given to a young child. Even though they might need help with things, even though they might struggle with some of the autonomy, they do need to be given the space to figure out who they are. And when I think about young children, I actually think about seeing one of my cousins grow. Kids have all sorts of interests, and even if that product that is created is a painting that they may be embarrassed of later, a sloppy performance at a t-ball game, or singing off-key at their elementary school's choir, with a lot of love and nurturing of that curiosity, kids can excel and become something so great. Daniela connected nostalgia and fascism, which is absolutely true, and when I think about combating nostalgia, I think about fostering creativity and wonder, and those are weapons of anti-intellectualism, which loops back fully to fascism. Moving back from the ethical use of generative AI, this film again makes me think about my thoughts on the term AI artists. These are people who act like they're credible artists who've practiced for hundreds, if not thousands of hours on their art. It makes me think about how important it is to be able to practice these artistic skills regardless of medium, because if you don't practice, what is creative about typing a basic prompt into DALL-E? What about you is flexing any bit of creativity? Anybody can come up with an idea, but can you make a good idea? Can you execute something so artistic and meaningful and express that into the world? Tell me about shading, about composition. Tell me about what inspires you. And all that exploration is what makes the great artists in the world great, including those at every single level at Studio Ghibli. To clarify as well, I don't think all of nostalgia is bad. Only Yesterday is likely one of the most underrated films from Studio Ghibli, focusing on our connection to the past really heavily, while also creating this contrast for our protagonist currently living in the urban setting of the city, and the flawed assessment of viewing that as an evolution in the country setting she was raised in. And I also find it really interesting that Aisawa Takahata, probably the second most known director from Studio Ghibli, would also explore similar, if not the same, themes about urbanism, destroying nature, and Pompoko, that weird little raccoon movie that people get mad at when I say it is probably a bottom 5 or bottom 8 Studio Ghibli movie. Not necessarily believing that all these films have one interpretation, or again, that these films don't have more themes games I'm not exploring today, but when you look at Princess Mononoke or Spirited Away or Ponyo, do you really think that anyone at Studio Ghibli would want you to engage in a practice that not only stunted your creative process or prevented you from bettering yourself artistically, but also have such a negative effect on the environment? And considering the anti-imperialist and clear anti-war sentimentalities of those at the company expressed in Nausicaa, Porco Rosso, Princess Mononoke, The Boy and the Heron, and Howl's Moving Castle, which kind of feels key to me in this video to name too, considering the fact that there's a level of romanticism around the characters, which I get. Christian Bale is dreamy as hell, I'm not going to ignore that, but I also think there's a bit of nuance and dialogue centered around the world of that film that's lost in the English dub. And again, there is no fault of anyone romanticizing this film, I get it, but it's hilarious to me that Miyazaki had such distaste for the Iraq War and the US's involvement in that war that he made a whole film about his distaste of that war, and also chose not to receive his Oscar for Spirited Away because he did not want to step foot in a country that was bombing Iraq. And somehow, Howl's Moving Castles turned into this ultimate cozy aesthetic movie for the majority of Westerns thinking about Studio Ghibli. Thinking about what I named before with the US military, or to extend that and speak to the White House using these ChatGPT generated images in the style of Studio Ghibli, when so casually speaking about deportations and abductions, why would the company support or endorse any of this? To me, thinking about the use of generative AI in the style of Studio Ghibli is upsetting and hypocritical and doesn't surprise me at all. Most people don't think about these things in the way that you or I, if you're watching this video, probably are, but just feels like an extension of people never attempting to use any comprehension skills for these films. And to me, this all makes me sad because these films are much more amazing and rich than people realize. I think honestly we should engage in a way that feels truthful to these films when we engage with the world, not just view them as an aesthetic. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you really enjoyed this video. If you want to see other videos from me where I talk about movies or videos like this, consider liking, commenting, share your favorite Studio Ghibli movie down below, share your thoughts on generative AI. Also consider subscribing, hitting that bell, checking the other videos I've done. I did a video recently on David Lynch, I did one on The Brutalist, I've done one on Amelia Perez. I talk about a lot of things on here. I'm still very early in my journey here, and the support is very, very appreciated. I also post daily on TikTok. I'm also posting movie reviews on Letterboxd. I've been using it for the past 5 years. I watch a lot of movies, so you can see a lot of my thoughts just generally on there. I'm also on Blue Sky, I'm also on Instagram. For anybody who's seen my videos before, you're seeing a lot less of my face than usual because I'm actually in the middle of a move. I'm also actually going on vacation the next day after I record this outro. And I also just really want to do this outro to show off some of the Studio Ghibli stuff I have. To my left right here, I have some Blu-rays. I'm wearing a shirt from Graveyard Goods, one of my favorite places to get movie-related shirts. They do a different drop every single week. The Spirited Away one happened a little while ago. They did the Howl's Moving Castle. They don't primarily do anime, so I don't really know what else they'll ever do from Studio Ghibli. I also have this 4K Steelbook from Shout Factory from The Boy and the Heron, one of my favorite Studio Ghibli movies. And my spouse actually got this for Valentine's Day. This is from Poster Atati. They release a lot of posters. No, this is not an ad, but they release a lot of promotional information for movies out there. This was a DVD promotional kind of thing that they had for Princess Mononoke back in Japan. Such a cool thing. So glad my spouse got this for me, and I just want to show it off, and I didn't have as much of an opportunity to show it off here. And I hope to see you all very, very soon.